Hello, I just wanted to do a quick response to a point made in a recent video by that guy T, in which he argued points made by the no true anarchist leftist guy. I can't remember his name, you'll have to forgive me. But the point made was one regarding small state or minarchist libertarians, which T sort of was in agreement with that the other guy made. And this was regarding small state or minarchist libertarianism lacking A, internal logical consistency, and B, ultimately resulting in the current political climate in which we live. And I wanted to address these points one by one. The first point regarding internal logical consistency, I think, stems from assumptions made typically by anarcho-capitalists regarding from where libertarians justify their policy views. And I think often there's a misconception that this is always from the point of the non-aggression principle, which is, in my view, not the case. So in order to just sort of set out a framework for why I think this, I'm going to briefly go over what I view as the three internally logically consistent justification for libertarian policies. Oh no, he's trying to justify, or rather categorize libertarians. I know, it's just a sort of simple tool I like to use in order to make this simpler in my head. So, as far as the categories go, the first of which are libertarians who justify their policy choices based on the non-aggression principle. Anybody in this category is either an anarcho-capitalist or kidding themselves. It's really as simple as that. The second category are those who justify having government institutions insofar as these institutions only exist for services which do not answer the free rider problem, that being, the benefits conveyed by public goods are conveyed on all members of a population, whether or not they pay into that service. So the problem that I have with this justification, even though it is, as I view, internally logically consistent, is that then we have to have a sort of argument over what actually is a public good. People on the left might argue, you could say that healthcare or the benefits conveyed by unions are public goods because, like, something positive human rights, and then somebody on the right might counter that with, no, those aren't public goods because they're excludable. It's a little too ambiguous for my taste, and it just sort of, you're opening yourself up to go into a mire of just this endless debate over that topic. The third internally logically consistent justification for libertarianism, and the one that I personally subscribe to, is that similarly to the previous group, you can justify having government institutions insofar as they only exist to ensure negative human rights. And in comparing negative human rights to public goods, I think negative human rights are much less ambiguous, so that makes it just simpler to justify. So negative human rights, things like life, property, with the caveat of discluding taxes in order to support institutions which guarantee the other negative human rights. So that would include things like defensive military, courts, law enforcement. Really only those three things, actually. Infrastructure is something that can easily be better served with the market. It's a bit like a negative feedback loop, really, where you tax only to the point of being able to fund these minimal government institutions. Now, you may not agree with taxation on the principle that it's aggression by the government or some other monopoly on force of law enforcement. However, I think that you do need to accept that while you might not agree with it, it is still internally logically consistent, much in the same way that what I view as your terming of the non-aggression principle is, in order to justify certain things. It just ultimately leads us to slightly different conclusions, that being whether or not we should have a very small, limited government, as I defined it, limited to those three branches, those three services, versus no central government. Now, the second point that was made sort of against small state or minarchist libertarianism was one regarding that, okay, any sort of effort or endeavor into having a small state is ultimately going to result in an accumulation of power, thus leading to the sort of climate that we currently have. I don't think this is a criticism that you can levy against only small state libertarianism, but not against anarchism. I don't know if you've read any of Robert Nozick's work, but he's very astutely pointed out in his book, I believe it's Liberty, Anarchy, and the State. You'll have to forgive me if I'm getting that wrong. That ultimately you're going to have an accumulation of power in an anarchist society, whether or not you like it. And what that's ultimately going to lead to is a decision on the part of the populace of what kind of state are we going to have. Are we going to have one that is strictly defined under a constitution, and I'll get to that in a second, or are we just going to continue on in the direction that we're going with an accumulation of power? So, again, I don't think this is so much a criticism of only a small state as it is just how strongly you end up defining the way that you have a government. A lot of, at least in America, a lot of libertarians will say, oh, we have to have a strict interpretation of the Constitution in order to ensure that there is no further expansion of the government. I would actually go even further and say that we need to redraft the Constitution and strike certain portions, make it a lot tighter, take out things like the Commerce Clause and other such things, make it simpler, make it less flexible, and maybe even go through the Bill of Rights and simplify things, remove some ambiguity. Again, it's ultimately all, at least the way I view it, all that a constitution should exist for is to ensure that negative human rights are not infringed. So, again, you might not agree with that, that's fine, but as far as for sake of argumentation, I don't think that saying, oh, a minarchist is not being honest with himself or not consistent logically is not really fair, because, I might frame the argument of how or why we should have a state differently than how you might, you being, not at all. So yeah, I just wanted to get that out there. Yeah, it is what it is.